Can we reimagine the systems we live in? How can economics reflect our common humanity? And can we change it in time?
Welcome back to Real Time with Steve and friends. We've got Ann Pettifor back with us for the second time. It's going to be a whole lot of fun. We're going to talk everything economics. She might have a few controversial things to say. Who knows? Be kind, stay safe, and enjoy the show.
Hey everybody, I'm back. Thanks for the applause. Thank you for the applause. I am back for one more show. It's an honor to be back with the group again with Steve and friends. Today's guest is a return of Ann Pettifor. I think I can speak for the whole panel and say that Ann is a beloved guest and a very good friend of Steve Keen. I'm going to break with tradition a little bit, and I would like Ann to join me right now in the studio. Ann, come on in. I want to bring you in as soon as possible. We have a topic to talk about today, which is modern monetary theory. Mm-hmm. Now, the issue that there's aspects of this theory, which, as Mike's going to point out, it's not so much a theory, but there are aspects of this that are controversial. And there's aspects of what you're going to talk about that are controversial. So what I'd like to warm the audience up with is a little bit of an Ann story. Now, the last time you were on the show, you talked about Muhammad Ali. You remember that? I'd like you to sketch out that story for the audience. I'd like you to bring us back to that and step us through how you got to meet him and what the background story was on that. It's such a beautiful story.
So the background story is that I was leading a campaign for the cancellation of the debts of the poorest countries. And we realized we had to raise the profile of the campaign. It was apparently arcane. It was apparently about debt. It was apparently about the international financial architecture. How were we going to communicate this to the wider public and get them behind us in order to put pressure on the G7 finance ministers? And we came up with the idea we'd ask Muhammad Ali to come along and join us. Because what had become clear is that it had become a sort of anti-racist campaign. You know, most of the countries that we were really concerned about were in Africa. And people say, oh, you can't trust those Africans, you know, they're incompetent, they're corrupt, blah, and blah. And anyway, I pay my mortgage. So we had this big problem. Anyway, we had Muhammad, he arrived with his entourage. And it was quite an extraordinary experience to meet him at the airport at Gatwick with his team, right? And by this time he was quite unwell, but not that bad really. And so on the way into town, I just talked to him about the campaign. I said, look, we're trying to get the debts cancelled for these poor countries, but we're up against the sort of racist attitudes towards these poor countries, mainly because they're black, and really we need your help, you know. And he was just wonderful. He just was amazing. He spoke at meetings. He went where we asked him to go to. He was celebrated here. I mean, we realized how much he was loved and what a passionate following he had. And then when it came time for him to go, he had this trick that he played with kids outside. He said he could levitate, you know, he could lift his feet off the ground. And it looked as if he had levitated. So, you know, but anyway, there came the time for him to say goodbye. And he was going up the lift to go up to his room, to his hotel room. And I went off with him to say goodbye. And he picked me up, and eyeball to eyeball, he said to me, Anne, never give up fighting racism. And then he dropped me down again because, of course, he was so much taller than I am.
Yeah.
He was a beautiful man. He really was.
Yeah. Steve, let's get Steve in here. He's going to share in that story because I know he loves that story. Steve, you remember hearing that?
I found out about the story when I was visiting Anne in your place is it Sussex, Anne?
Suffolk.
Your holiday place? Suffolk, pardon me. Yeah, and there's a statue of Muhammad Ali there. And I said, well, how did you get the statue? And the answer was from Muhammad Ali. That's a pretty good place to get yourself a souvenir. So most impressed.
Yeah. So I'm gonna turn this into a little bit of a democracy. Mike, why don't you come into the studio here too? Okay, we got Mike back in the studio. Kind of return of the old gang. And it's great. It really is great to see you. I want to thank you again for joining us this week. What do you guys think the best way is to delve into modern monetary theory? I mean, like, should we jump into the controversial part first, or what?
No, let's start with the part we can agree with, definitely.
Okay, yes.
Okay. Because there are controversies there which aren't necessarily central concepts behind what MMT is about. But there's a YouTube short that caused me a bit of angst. You know that my YouTube shorts are put together by a marketing company, and I don't know where the people are. It could be in India, could be, God knows, Afghanistan. I have no idea. But one of them came out, and they take things like my interview with Lex Friedman, and they'll take an excerpt from that and then put a headline on the thing, and then you watch the video. And the excerpt was titled "MMT is a lie!" exclamation mark. And I saw this, went, oh my God, what do I do about this? And then I watched the clip, and it was Lex Friedman asking me what MMT is, and I said, basically, it's accounting. If you understand assets and liabilities and equity, and you know that everything has to follow double entry bookkeeping. Thank you, Larry. You know that it's simply actually accurately describing the monetary system. And what neoclassical economists do, they have. Can I use French this early in the show? They've got fuck all idea about what the monetary system is. They put everything into a supply and demand. Thank you. They put everything into a supply and demand analysis. If you've got two intersecting lines, you've got a model. That's the way their brains work, if they do have brains anymore, after just believing their classical economic theory as school kids and university students. And they've started their concern, the supply of money and demand for money, and if the government spends more than it puts up the demand and doesn't change the supply, and that change, yada, 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 yada. You do the accounting and it's all crap. The government does not borrow. The government creates money when it spends more than it gets back in taxation. It issues bonds equivalent to that because it's required to avoid having a negative balance on its account at the central bank. So this is just strictly accurate accounting. And when you understand that the government is a money creator, it's not limited by it's not relying upon tax and bonds to spend, and all the decisions about austerity end up being completely wrong-headed. So that's I'm rushing to it too quickly. We'll obviously elaborate, but the part of MMT that we all agree with comes from the accounting side, and it's 100% accurate.
And well, can I say that what I think that is its problem, really, is that it is about accounting. And it's as if the economy was about accounting, and it's not. The economy is much more complex and much more interesting than that. And I was reading through what Stephanie Kelton was saying about Wynne Godley. And I was a great admirer of Wynne Godley's. It was only due to Wynne Godley that I was able to write a book in 2005, published in 2006, called The Coming First World Debt Crisis. When I woke up from what had happened to the low-income countries and the build-up of debt, and I looked at what was happening in the Anglo-American scene, it was very clear. And I read Godley assiduously. I was a great fan of his. But what he showed me wasn't just the accounting system. What he showed me was that the American consumers had built up massive amount of debt, had gone into negative equity, if you like, into negative savings. And in order to acquire real estate and part of the real estate boom. And when that money ran out, he said, the whole unbalanced system was going to blow up. And he was so right. He was absolutely right about that. But I just saw it in a very different way. I saw the real economy and what was happening in the American economy, and that he could see that. And of course, you can account for that perfectly. But that wasn't the point. I mean, the point was to look at what was happening in the economy. And I feel that much of it now, and I wanted to begin by saying that everyone who promotes MMT is on the whole progressive, is on the same side as I am, as Steve is. We're all progressives. And I want to acknowledge that. I also want to acknowledge that MMT has electrified the debate around money. And by God, was that time for that, really. The main economics profession doesn't understand money or the monetary system. And thirdly, that MMT focus explains why it's wrong for everyone to focus on one fiscal deficit, which is the public fiscal deficit, and not other deficits. And for that, I really applaud their work. But for me, there's a fundamental flaw at their in their idea of the monetary system, is the understanding of the nature of money. And this is where I've got to disagree with Steve. The government doesn't create money. The government has to issue a bond, a promise to pay, and the government has to pay. It has to uphold that promise, and all of the institutions of the monetary system are there to ensure that the government does uphold its promise. And the thing that brought this home to me so vividly was Keynes in 1919 in Europe. So Keynes is sitting in the dereliction, in the destruction, in the havoc that is post-World War I Europe. And they're all the world's leaders, and they're looking for a solution way forward. And he comes up with a very simple plan. He suggests to the French, the British, and the Americans that they should issue a bond, a promise to pay. There should be no cash, no money, no sterling, no francs, no US dollars, just simply a promise to pay. And that promise to pay is collateral, is an asset, and would raise $1 million or about that. Is enough to restore economic activity, not just in Germany, but across the whole of Europe. It was worth a lot more money in those days. And that proposal would have caused Europe to recover from that crisis. But it's defeated. It's defeated by a man called Thomas Lamont, the ambassador of Wall Street, who is there as advisor to President Wilson. And he says, no. The government shouldn't issue a bond, because actually Wall Street is much better at issuing bonds. Furthermore, if the government were to issue a bond, that would crowd out Wall Street lending, right? Better for Wall Street to finance the recovery at very high rates of interest. And he defeats Keynes's proposal. And we know what the consequences were. There was no recovery. There was the rise of fascism, and there was catastrophic World War. Is that all it takes is this promise to pay, and that promise is backed up. That fiat money, if you want to call it that, is backed up by the health of the French, British, and American economies. Nothing else, really. And I think we don't. If we say that they simply printed the money That would be wrong. They didn't simply print the money. They didn't print any money. They simply issued a promise to pay. And for me, that's the fundamental flaw. And when I say that, of course, the government has to borrow. Of course, the government has an obligation when it issues a bond, and it has to honor that bond. I get viciously attacked. And for me, that's the...
And I'm going to disagree with you. We're going to have a
Yeah.
disagreement here. I think you're wrong about the accounting there. And that's one reason I designed Minsky, so that I could, elaborate these points properly. And if you look at what the government does when it sells bonds, it is required to issue bonds equivalent to the deficit plus the interest due on outstanding bonds. Those are the two components it's supposed to do that with. And so if you look at the government spending, the initial spending, of course, boosts deposit accounts, which is a bank liability. It also boosts bank reserves, which is a bank asset. And those reserves, your reserves used to be held at absolute minimal levels for so long before the financial crisis hit.
Mm-hmm.
But what happens with those bonds? I'll imagine the bonds. I'll take a situation where the bonds are where there are no bonds initially. Okay, so they give the very first government deficit. Government spends money, taxes less than it spends. It's therefore increased people's deposit accounts, and it's increased the reserves that the banks have, but to an equal amount. So reserves have gone up and deposits have gone up. Assets have risen, liabilities have risen. Bank liabilities are money. That's fundamentally the money creation task. Then, when the Treasury issues bonds equivalent to the deficit, plus interest on outstanding bonds, but I'm leaving those out for the moment. The only fund that the banks, the initial buyers of bonds, can buy those bonds with are reserves. Okay? So when we talk about borrowing and borrowing from the public, what people are thinking of is, I'm giving money from my deposit account to the government. Now that means your personal bank account will fall because you've bought government bonds and the government's borrowing money off you. So whether the actual phenomenon is your deposit account goes down, your holdings of bond goes up, and therefore the government has borrowed money from you. But that's everything. That's tough. That's an action taking place effectively all on the liability side of the bank system's ledger. What is actually happening when you look at the initial sale of bonds by the Treasury to the banking sector, and to what do the Americans call it? The registered dealers or primary dealers, the primary dealers. When that sale has occurred, the transaction is all on the asset side of the banking system. Their reserves go down, their bonds go up. Now that's not borrowing, as Stephanie says. That's converting one form. She calls it one form of money. I disagree there. It's not, because stuff on the asset side of the banking sector is not money. It's funds. So one form of funds goes down. That's reserves. They fall. The bonds go up by the same amount. There's no change in the value of the total value of bank assets when that's done. But what you've now got is they've swapped if we go back before the financial crisis, a non-income earning asset, which is reserves, for an income earning asset, which is bonds, and a non-tradable asset, which is reserves, for a tradable asset, which is bonds. And what that actually does, it isn't something which involves taking money from the public at all.
Steve,
and what it really does when you look at the accounting...
I want to interrupt here just for a minute, because
Okay. It stops the government, the Treasury, having a negative account at the central bank. That's really all the sale of bonds does.
Right, I get that. I think, okay, so if I can kind of summarize, I don't know if you guys are really presenting a disagreement here. I mean, okay, so Steve is explaining that, he's basically explaining the mechanics of how it works. And I think what Anne is focusing on is the qualitative instead of the quantitative. It's that commitment to promise, right? And
Yeah.
I want to explore that a little more. And the reason why I want to explore it a little more is that I do see that as one of the shortfalls or the criticisms from the opposition of modern monetary theory, is the lack of accountability, and a not an accounting accountability, and a moral accountability. right? So if it's untethered spending, this is really the heart of the criticism on the conservative side, right? Okay. So Anne, I mean, I'm not really seeing the disagreement here between Anne and Steve. Do you see that as well? Like, I mean, I don't think that what Steve was explaining it's the mechanics. He's rightfully explaining the mechanics of how that
Yeah,
works, right?
absolutely. And I agree. I absolutely agree. It's just the way in which MMT talks about this is to imply that it is actually quite a simple process and that it doesn't involve obligation. For me, it comes down to the confusion between apparent confusion between money and currency. You know, there are plenty, and I speak as someone who works on African issues a lot. You know, Zimbabwe's got a currency, but it doesn't have any money. Zimbabwe's got a currency. It's had 6 currencies in the last few years. The latest one is called ZIG, but it doesn't have the institutional upholding. It doesn't have the system. It doesn't have a monetary system that upholds the government's promise to pay. And so therefore, there is no confidence in the currency. And the currency doesn't get, so it prints lots of paper. It prints lots of currency. And it keeps printing new types of currency, but it doesn't make any difference. So I think it's about how important trust is in this. This is, and you're right, Dan. This is why I'm coming into it as a moral issue, really, as well. That the mechanics of the thing are one thing, but the real issue is that for currency to be meaningful as money, it has to be backed up by a meaningful economy. You know, the United States' currency is backed up by a $25 trillion economy. It's backed up by something like 166 million taxpayers, right? You know, Zimbabwe's economy doesn't have that. And even if it had that, it has no trust in the managers of the economy to deal with those revenues appropriately. So this is I think this is my point, that we talk about currency so loosely, and then we don't talk about money for really what it's about, you know. And I think economists have succeeded massively in making money sound terribly complicated, when actually it's a social construct. It's something that we invented to enable us to transact. We invented it to enable us to do what we can do. And by blinding us with the science of it, we really make it very difficult for the public to hold, monetary officials and politicians and technocrats to account for the way in which they abuse that trust, essentially.
And, I love it. And the subtle compliment there, Steve, I don't know if you picked it up, but she just, she just accredited economics with a science. That's great.
See, what's actually, so, and anyways, this was...
what we're gonna do, guys, we gotta time out. We gotta do top chatters, and it's gonna be Mike, because Mike's had nothing to do yet in the show, and he's chomping at the bit. I think he really wants to say something about MMT, but he's gonna have to wait until after he reads the top chatter list. Go ahead and start with Thomas. There,
okay, Dan. Hi to everybody. Let's see if we can get through this without, with a minimum number of errors. So Tamaz Sherday, Tony Wilson, Dre Guy, Econ in One Lesson, Gavin Van, Larry Summers is back with us yet again. TR, D. Bruce, Douglas Dowell, JD, Lana Dell, Ghost on the Half Shell, Tom Roberts, Political Econ 101, Bob Liori, Harvey J. K, Chris Focus, and Excel, Tom Kopp, Joe Polito, Graham Boyd, Danny, Blue Bay, Matt T 3431433. That's, I don't know, his pin or something. Torrential Rage, Danger Zone, Jesus or Jesus, Michael D'Souza Cruz, Chase B. Anderson, Philippi Burns, Django Geek, Manahoran, Josh Buckham, Petrified Produce, Ronald Vormwald, Bob Dones, Andrew Sullivan, Snert Rich, Doc Tucson, Shot, Thomas Darlington, Owen Wall, K. Kebab, Rick O'Brien, Michael Newman, JD Roybal, and Mal Curie, I guess. The list is bigger every time there's more.
Mike, what do you think so far here about the Ann Pettifor Steve pseudo disagreement and the qualitative framework that Ann's putting forth here for discussion?
Yeah, well, there's quite a lot to unpack. So you're right, Dan. Modern monetary theory is not modern. It's really been around for 100 years at least, if not more. If you want to go back to the Medicis in the 15.
I want to go back to John Law in 1705.
Yeah, so it's certainly not modern, and it's not a theory. It's mostly a mechanical description of how a modern fiat currency system works. There's a lot of problems, though, right? One is the general public, and for that matter, highly educated politicians suffer from the fallacy of composition. They think about their house or their business or their city government, which has to balance its budget annually. One trip around the sun, you've got to balance. And they think with a sovereign nation with sovereign fiat currency, well, it must be the same. And it's not. But they can't make that conceptual leap. No one's taught them to make that conceptual leap. So that's a problem. The econ profession is those people, they're not stupid people, but they have been socialized into a particular path-dependent process that says, here's the stuff you need to know to succeed in your profession. And so everybody just does that, right? And, coloring outside the lines doesn't get you anywhere. Or, you got to be a Steve Keen who doesn't conform. But everybody likes to conform and get along and get promoted and what have you. So, I mean, in terms of the issue of trust and modern monetary theory says, swing for the fences, buy whatever you want. There's no constraints. It's unlimited. Of course, no other than Abel Lerner discussed and recognized a little later in life that inflation is the problem. And he came up with, a market anti-inflation plan with Dave Colander, for example. I think the problem with economists and politicians is they think the way to deal with inflation is with deficit spending. And that's the wrong place to look for a solution. I think it's something like, Lerner's market bait, where you have to buy permits to raise your prices or something along those lines, a buffer stock or a negative feedback loop, a system that would stabilize things and not let things get out of control. Finally, last point, modern monetary theory really can benefit from the concept of stocks and flows and being able to model stocks and flows. I can show you a paper written by Irving Fisher in like 1899, where he was explaining stocks and flows to economists. So economists are aware of stocks and flows. Ken Boulding in 1950 wrote a whole book, Reconstructing Economics, around the concept of the balance sheet, a stock, right? So economists have the tools or the concepts, they just don't use them properly. And that's where what Steve and I are doing with system dynamics modeling, we can help. We don't need T accounts anymore. You can make godly tables
in the butt. Yeah. No, people can't read them most of the time, and they're obscure.
Yeah. So we now have modern tools to take the concepts that economists are familiar with and properly represent things. Last point, I said this will be my last point, I guess, and that is, oh no, I lost my train of thought. I'll think of it in a minute. So press on. I had it and it escaped.
So
I might come into the point about why do we call it modern monetary theory? Because Tony is saying it. Tony Wilson said here in the chat that it's been around for 3,500 years, and that's quite true. If you go back and look at the anthropology, that's the work that David Graeber used to do, that Michael Hudson still does on the origins of money. Fiat money has been around ever since there's been a state of any description. But the reason we call it modern is because bloody neoclassical economists got in the way and whacked this stupid blind demand. man diagram into everything. Marshals, just add two intersecting lines, and you've got a model. And they don't want money to have any significant role. So the reason that we call it modern, it's called modern monetary theory, is because for the last 1.5 centuries, a bunch of morons called neoclassical economists have modeled money completely wrongly. They talk about what they call the money multiplier. Now, when you look at the accounting, that model only works if all money is in the form of cash. Otherwise, you cannot have loans that actually come out of that system. They talk about loanable funds as if banks borrow off the public to lend. I'm having George Selgin here a couple of weeks' time. He thinks banks borrow from each other to be able to lend. You do the system dynamics, they're wrong. They're simply wrong. So what modern monetary theory is bringing back an old idea and saying it should be what we think about modern money in the modern world. It's not that it's a modern idea, it's an old idea which is correct, and we're getting rid of the neoclassicals who stuffed everything up.
Yeah, I just thought of my last point. Sorry, just to complete my my little rant there, and that is economists are not trained to get out from behind their desks and find out how the system really operates. They either do theory, which means constrained optimization problems. So you're taught these mathematical contraptions that you have to solve. And then real world means you go to a website and you download numerical data and you torture it with econometrics and statistics. Never are you asked to get out from behind your desk and go to a bank and find out what they do, or go to a corporation and find the person who does pricing and say, how do you price your product? They never do that. We're not trained to do that, right? And if we were, our models would be more realistic, I think.
And I think where you want to take this, I'm just guessing. You tell me if I'm on the right path here. I want to return to the idea of trust, right? Because there's nothing that either Steve or Mike is addressing in terms of the promissory note and reinforcing trust with the people that are actually receiving the money, right? So is that kind of the idea? Is that how you would take it?
Sure. I mean, I think trust is incredibly important and is a social construct. It's something that we manage socially. It's not mechanical. It's not, so that's terribly important. The other thing that's really important is power. And part of what I worry about when we think about it in this mechanical, this accounting way, we don't think about it in terms of politics and power. And money is incredibly political at every level. It's political. And so there's a danger. Now, of course, economists, as Steve says, they don't want to think, as Mike says, they don't want to think about it in real terms, in terms of what is really happening to the firm and to the individual and to the household. Nor do they think about it in aggregate terms, in what's happening in a macro sense to the economy. But they certainly don't want to think about it in political terms. They pretend it's not political. They pretend they're apolitical. And for me, that's what's really, really important, because money is so political. And I worry about this emphasis on it's an accounting system. You just have to balance this and that. You leave out power and politics. And so, and I have such problems with, deficit spending. We have, when we think about power here in Britain, the person who is most fond of fiscal deficits in our country is a Conservative politician called George Osborne. In 2010, after the great financial crisis, when actually the private sector blew a hole in the whole of the economy, this massive a crater of non-economic activity, and the deficit went through the roof. And Mr. Osborne proved to be absolutely loyal to the maintenance of that deficit. He was not going to do anything to bring it down. He became a deficit spender, if you like. And I just think, that we've got to get this right, because from his perspective, he was not going to lift a finger of the public sector finances to help rescue the private sector economy. There was a crater of non-economic activity in the economy, and he dug that hole deeper by actually trying to constrain public spending and trying to constrain the ability of government to fix the hole, the crater. And so he maintained a fiscal deficit. And when the left argues that fiscal deficits are a jolly good thing, I think about the political power of George Osborne and what he did with his fiscal deficit. He used it, he maintained it in order to smash up our public services, in order to smash up welfare here, in order to impoverish the poor even further, in order to enrich the rich, right? And we are celebrating these fiscal deficits. So and I think that's because we're thinking about it in accounting terms and not in terms of political power. Now, I'm not against a fiscal deficit. I think it's absolute. When the pandemic hit, our fiscal deficit rose to 20% of GDP, massively, right? There was a crater of non-economic activity called the pandemic. And as a result, the public sector had to step in and had this huge, and that was a jolly good thing they did. Right. But actually what was really more important was to restore private economic activity and restore some balance to the economy, not to balance the budgets, not to be obsessed about that, but to say, look, this hole of unemployment, this hole of non-investment, this hole of non-production, can we please fill it up with some investment, with some employment, with some production? Because that would really be the best thing to do. Instead, we're saying, do you see where I'm going, Dan? Am I right?
Yeah. I think so. The mix is important. And Steve, I think, how does your work address the actual recipe of economic activity? Right.
Well, the point that Anne's making there is that when we're talking about the strict accounting, we're simply saying what the monetary mechanisms are. What you spend the money on matters as well. If I had to say how the Australian government uses MMT, is to prop up the housing bubble, okay? Because the government, every time there's a sign of the housing rate of growth of house prices faltering a bit, they double or treble the amount of money they give to first home buyers. They do anything they can to maintain the bubble. So you've got, in a sense, the political power is there. The power of the state is controlled by people who are themselves caught up in the entire property game, and they don't know that they're doing MMT, but because you're using the government capacity to create money and then using that money to prop up the property bubble, you're basically maintaining a Ponzi scheme. And so that's incredibly, destructive, unfair, and its power. It's political. Yeah. And like I thought, having seen this happen in Australia, I thought, TR saying so I won't be correct in Australia as well. When I saw this happening with Australia, when Kevin Rudd doubled and trebled the first home buyers grant, the week after I was on national TV talking about the danger of a recession from the crisis back in 2007 or 2008, I can't remember quite which year. It was just simply using the state's capacity to keep the bubble going. And I said the only way I can see this ending is once the baby boomers start dying off and their kids take over and become the majority. And then in that situation, there'll be more kids without houses than with houses. So putting up house prices will make them poorer, not richer, and they'll vote against the baby boomer politicians who've maintained the housing bubble all this time period. Still hasn't happened. We're getting closer and closer to the point, though, where
it's happening now in Britain. It's happening here in Britain, right?
The young are so disenfranchised by the way that the baby boomer generation has used the power of the state to maintain a property bubble, which, has benefited the baby boomers. It really is a power issue, as you say.
And it's what Greenspan did before 2007 as well. It's what, it was the neoliberal ideology, if you like, to pump credit out endlessly and to fuel the real estate bubble in the United States until it blew up.
And let the banking sector do what it damn well likes. And this is this is what I find a real tragedy of the way that neoclassical economics has been used politically. And it includes this naivety about money as well, because a huge part of their pressure says we shouldn't spend on social security, shouldn't spend on health, shouldn't spend on infrastructure, blah, blah, blah. Of course, we'd have to spend on military. That's absolutely necessary. But then they've got totally caught up in maintaining the votes from the baby boomer generation, and you do that by causing their assets to appreciate. So they're using the state capacity to create money to keep the bubble going. And you really have to have both the politics and the accounting correct. And unfortunately, at the moment, we have both of them wrong. And, I focus on getting the accounting right, because once you do, it's like looking out through a telescope and seeing that there are craters on the moon and there are moons of Saturn and moons of Jupiter. And that eliminates the idea that the Earth is the center of the universe. Same thing when you look at money properly. The neoclassical vision is, like, I call it Tolmec economics these days, because it presumes equilibrium, presumes a fixed system, and they don't want to look at the actual data. If you go look at the data, you look at the structure of banking and so on, you realize that the accounting of MMT and the credit approach to money that Anne and I've been heavily involved in developing as well, they're correct. The mainstream is wrong. But they push us out of the way, and it's still the same bullshit being pumped out all the time. And when they use the bullshit to ignore banks, but the real effect of their stuff is to empower banks to become the political force in capitalist societies to the detriment of capitalism.
Yeah, I think one of the big problems with the banking system, at least in the United States, is lack of accountability. When the bankers mess up and overdrive their headlights, engage in moral hazard, they're too big to fail. So the government bails them out, but no one is ever punished for that behavior. And so what do you learn? Well, go ahead and do it again, because we'll get bailed out and I won't get punished. Maybe not jailed, but you certainly should be banned from the industry, if you mess up like that.
Interesting. Steve, I'd like to talk about your example of the housing bubble just for a minute. And I think I'd like to focus more on the standard of living for young folk. Okay, so let's maybe focus on that and give me the two scenarios. You're basically saying that, or I'm wondering if what you're proposing is like you're proposing a not continuing or feeding and amplifying the housing bubble, right? So does this inevitably lead to a standard of living for new, young potential home buyers or renters where their standard of living is what? What do they have to look forward to under a Steve Keen policy?
And unless you have wealthy parents who can give you money that helps you buy your first home, I don't think if you come from a family of renters, there's no way you can buy property. Because everything that the neoclassicals have advocated has been done at the expense of the kids these days. So baby boomers like myself got free university education. Now they've got to borrow money to do a university education. So they leave with private debt or debt to the government, but their own debt to the government sector for tertiary borrowing. The house prices are you certainly can't afford to buy a house out of a standard income. So you've got to therefore have assets to sell, or you've got to be able to acquire debt to buy the property. And that rules out anybody who doesn't have parents that themselves own property. So in some ways, what we've had, the way that this power of the state has been used to keep the bubble rolling, and it's particularly in Australia, but it's also a similar thing in England as well. That's actually disenfranchised. It turned us almost into a system now. If you have parents with property, you can buy property. If you don't have parents with property, you can't. And that's almost like a return to feudalism.
But Steve, for me, what it's about is the liberalization, the deregulation of capital flows. The fact that actually there's a wall of money out there aimed at finite assets like London property prices, London property. And London property is confined within, a small island. It's mainly Victorian. You can't do much with it. It's a very finite asset. And throw a wall of money at it, that inflates the value of that property and denies access to young people who need to buy a roof over their heads. And then at the same time, the state is curtailed and prevented from investing in public housing by law, and this is political power again. And so young people have nowhere to go, and rents follow the wall of money. It's inflated constantly. So it's about, financial deregulation, essentially. It's about the international free flow of capital across the world. We have a wall of money originating in Nigeria, in the United States, in China, in Russia. It's all aimed at this finite asset called London property, or property in the UK. So really, it's the global system that is actually hurting young people and denying young people access to a roof over their heads. And we therefore have to fix the international system. And that, for me, that's really the big issue at the time. No individual government can do that on its own. The international financial architecture, as designed by Wall Street, essentially, with a lot of help from economists, is such that actually it's beyond the reach of most governments. It's beyond
unless
the
they
reach.
bring in capital controls. They bring capital controls and stuff like that they get criticised for by economists.
Not just capital controls, but internationally coordinated capital controls. Now, the whole of the design of the architecture is such that actually that coordination is not possible. And Keynes understood that the monetary system was really important from the point of view of coordination. That was what he was about. Anyway, so for me, it's about, if young people can't buy or can't rent property in my country anymore, it's because of the nature of the deregulated international financial system. And we really have to talk about that.
Well, I think it goes just beyond young people not having a roof over their heads. It damps household formation, fertility rates below replacement level, and all that sort of. So there's lots of implications.
Yeah, absolutely correct.
Mm-hmm. 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 Well, So I'm curious then, can we maybe step through an example of what a coordinated international monetary solution would look like?
Well, it looks a lot like Bretton Woods, right? But it also looks a lot like, in my view, Keynes's International Clearing Union. And I'm discussing this at the moment with many European economists. And we're looking in particular at Africa, which could have a payments union, which would mean that Africa wouldn't have to resort to the fetish for liquidity, to the fetish for the dollar, but would actually simply exchange and transact on the basis of its own productive capacity. And, so what's fundamental to Keynes's proposal is that you don't need to have this thing called liquidity, this thing called the dollar, this thing called cash. Actually, you can transact with each other on the terms of your own ability to produce, and through those transactions, trade, economic development can be encouraged. We saw that happen in the 1950s here in Europe with the European Payments Union. So there's a way of looking at the way in which the financial system works, which actually emphasizes, productive economic activity on the one hand, and not the financialization, deregulation of the system, really, and tries to block out that whole financialization of the system, because that's what is causing the harm at the moment. These are very big issues, Dan. I'm afraid I don't feel
I think that's a good starting point. I'm going to go in turn with Mike and then also Steve to say, let's explore this. Let's give an example of what a coordinated international response would be in this to kind of alleviate or not fix the problem. I mean, you guys are system dynamic thinkers, so I like the way Steve talks about amplifying or dampening. So let's start with Mike and let's just to remind you, we're looking at coordinated international solutions that either amplify or dampen a complex system. So you have to identify the problem. Go ahead, Mike.
Well, I think a lot of Keynes's ideas involved what we would call in dynamic modeling negative feedback loops or thermostats, stabilizing mechanisms. And the Bancorp system, I believe, was one of those. Now, today, is it still exactly what he said? should be what we do today. I'm not sure about that, but it cries out for using Minsky and doing dynamic modeling to redesign the airplane, to say, okay, there's a bunch of proposals about how we might do this. Let's explore the dynamic implications of redesigning the system this way versus that way. And then, as Anne has correctly pointed out, like at Bretton Woods, if you can come up with a really good design, that doesn't mean it's going to be implemented, because the U.S. said, hey, we won the war, so we're doing it our way. I don't care how good your system is. Right. So now you got to get it implemented.
But the point is, Mike, the reason we did that was because we thought that the currency was really important, right? And Keynes wanted a sort of non-currency for the exchange and the trade of goods and services, really. But so this comes back to economists and the ideology of what really matters is the currency and the cash, the liquidity. When actually what he was arguing, what really matters is using a monetary system for production. And so I just feel that's part of my problem with MMT as well, is that this emphasis on the currency and on cash and on liquidity, that is the fetish, really. And that's what that's why White was able to defeat Keynes, because that ideology took precedent over what he was trying to argue. We can overcome that fetish. We don't need to reinforce it from the left, is what I'd like to argue.
Yeah. What's interesting is traditionally trained economists are often accused of doing the exact opposite, is ignoring money and just looking at the real economy. So it's a Goldilocks problem. We can't ignore either one. We got to find the happy medium.
Sure.
So we're going to go to Steve in a sec. I think there was
Mike, can I just sort of, Mike is right. Economists think like that. Wall Street doesn't think like that. Wall Street thinks in terms of cash, liquidity, and money. And I should have made that clear.
Yeah. We're going to go to Steve in a second, but there was an interesting question about Bancor type tokens that I think, Anne, I'd like you to comment on, because you brought up Bretton Woods. So can you kind of fill in the gaps? And this is for a commenter, how to build a world brain. So kind of suitable for the for the international network. So Anne, go ahead, and then we'll go to Steve.
So his idea of the Bancor is pretty much what Steve was explaining when he talked about central bank reserves. These are monies which stay very narrowly within the system, which can't be used in the real economy. They're used to settle accounts within the system. And so we have reserves within the banking system. Central bank has reserves, but they're only used within the banking system. They can't be used outside of the bank. It's not a money that can be used in the street, if you like. And Bancor is pretty much the same. It's a thing that just is, and you may not need a currency, but it's just a way of keeping an account of the balances in the system. They're multilateral. I trade gold with you and you sell me silver, and there's a difference in valuation of those two things, and I owe you, you owe me, and we've got to manage those IOUs carefully, and we can do it in the form of a currency, or we can just keep the accounts, basically, or something, an institution at the center just keeps the accounts. And reminds people, you've got an overdraft, you've got a surplus, will you please sort your overdraft, will you please sort your surplus? And if you don't, I'm disciplining you with either a higher interest rate or whatever. I will find ways of disciplining those imbalances in order to bring them back into some sort of stability. So Bancor would be just that nominal thing, like central bank reserves.
Interesting. Okay. And
What
Steve,
Anne's describing there is effectively what Graziani called the hierarchy of money, and you'll find the same thing in some of the MMT people as well. And what you should have is money and currency being used at the level of individual and non-bank transactions, reserves being used for transactions between banks, and Bancor being used for transactions between countries. You have three completely separate circulation systems, interrelated obviously, but not mixing the three. And that's what the real world to some extent is and certainly should be. But what we had out of White, Harry Dexter White and Bretton Woods is we're using a domestic currency for international trade.
Yeah.
And so we're scrambling all that stuff together and making a complete fist of it. And that in some ways is what we want to get away from, which the neoclassicals have imposed on us by not understanding the money system.
You know, I'd like to bring up one thing, and then we got about 5 minutes, and then we're gonna get into something enjoyable, funny, and a little bit the mean tweets, right, Steve? So this is a relatively new thing that the show producer has put together. It's a lot of fun, I think, right? So when Mike was explaining system dynamics and putting together a variety of different proposals and then modeling the proposals, I think this is extremely intuitive, but it's not really a pushback. It's more of a surprise to say, why hasn't that work been done? I mean, and why isn't it being done out of the economics tradition? Your graduate class, Mike, or, like, I don't understand. We're not talking about an infinite number of novel ideas. We're talking about very repetitive political solutions, from austerity to stimulus spending. So why is that not basically put into models and based off of individual nations right now? Why don't we have those models available?
So I think people have been writing books. People like Paul Davidson has written a book that explains his mind, modern versions of sort of the Keynesian system. It hasn't been modeled with, let's say, Minsky or system dynamics properly. I don't know. Maybe somebody's done it, but certainly it's not in all the textbooks or anything. But I think the real issue is getting it adopted, because what you're going to do is come up with a new design of the airplane, and all the people who like the present design of the airplane are going to say, no way. We're just doing fine, thank you very much, with our system the way it is. So I think academics can put forth all sorts of wonderful schemes, and we'll represent them with differential equations and all the proper modeling techniques and what have you. Fine, but now somebody has to agree to adopt it, and lots of luck with that, because fighting the status quo.
That's called political power.
Gotcha.
We have to mobilize political power, but to do that, we have to have credible theories. We have to have credible answers. We have to have credible policies, which people can get behind. And they can't get behind something terribly abstract and an abstract mathematical model. That's not going to mobilize people. And so I think economists would rather not talk about how to build political power, because actually it's much easier to just manage mathematical models. Building political power takes ideas which can be influential and which can move whole groups of people, really. And I come back to Jubilee 2000. The idea was cancel the debts of the poorest countries, make the creditors discipline the creditors, don't just discipline the debtors. Now that was incredibly ideological. That was an idea that there was a moral standing, and it mobilized people. People said, yes, it's outrageous to use usury, because actually the system is usurious. We don't use that word anymore because it's an old-fashioned biblical word, but it means extracting and exploiting the most vulnerable, right? And when you explain to people that that's how the system worked, they stood up and they were outraged. 100,000 people turned up at the G7 in Birmingham, right? To say, I'm outraged that you're using this financial system to extract from the poor. So we had ideas, we had policies. The policy was cancel the debt by a certain date, right? And we had answers to the public, but economists would rather stay in their ivory towers And I think that's what I'm trying to say, is that those ivory towers exclude political power and the ability to mobilize political power. But I'm going off at a tangent here, Dan.
But Anna's right. Jay Forrester used to always tell us, or tell me anyway, that why are you writing articles for econ journals? He said, all you're doing is writing economists or writing for other economists, and all they care about is journal articles and econ journals. They don't care about the economy. So write for the general public, write for the business community. Don't write for economists.
Yeah.
I think that's an important point to raise in terms of MMT, because to some extent that's why they've been successful. Because a lot of people who aren't professional economists have latched onto it. The fundamental message comes through. You don't have to have a cutback in social security. You don't have to destroy education to balance the books. It's all a misnomer. It's about
you can have a Green New Deal.
They can have a Green New Deal.
The subtle thing. Bring it up, guys. Bring up her book. Bring it up.
But Steve, you know, the impression is given that you can just print money, and that feeds not the public, that feeds the right. The right thinks, yeah, this is what the left's going to do, and it's going to be inflationary. And MMT says, yes, it will be inflationary. And when it is, we're going to tax you further. And I find that ridiculous, really. Can you imagine? We've just lived through a cost of living crisis. If MMT had been applied, we would have hit Rishi Sunak, our prime minister, who's raised taxes over this last period, would have had an ally in MMT. And I mean, that for me is extraordinary, to use taxes at a time of high inflation, when inflation is not caused by, I don't know, I mean, the causes of inflation are complicated. And in my view, it have a lot to do with international speculation on commodity prices, which we don't talk about. And then to tax the public when at that moment of inflation, when their cost of living is going down, how can the left be arguing that? I find that extraordinary.
I mean, there are issues about saying you can use taxation as an anti-inflationary measure, and I think that's okay. And the reason is taxation's a shithouse way for the government to take money out of circulation, because fundamentally, if you
the government doesn't take money out of circulation, what happens is the government, well, what should happen is the government invests, creates economic activity. Economic activity generates income. That income is then generates tax revenues. The government, Stephanie Kelton says, the government imposes taxes. You can't impose taxes. 40% of the American public don't pay any taxes at all. 60% pay taxes. 40% don't. You can't impose taxes. Taxes are a consequence of economic activity. And by framing it in that way, MMT is making it sound as though the government can just wave a wand and impose taxes, and does so to cure inflation, which I find ridiculous, when actually taxation is a consequence, is a result of economic activity. It's not something the government can do. It can set the level of taxes, of course, and it has laws to enforce so that if you do generate income, you do have to pay your taxes. But it can't impose taxes on 40% of the population who are not economically active.
Yeah. And 60% are going to push back with any increase in tax whatsoever. Mike, go ahead, and then we're going to jump into mean tweets.
Yeah, I think one of the problems too is that it's not only that we fight inflation, or governments fight inflation with sort of a simplistic, set of tools, austerity, deficit restraints, taxation, and so forth. But Tom Pally has a nice paper where he describes 6 different types of inflation.
Yeah.
That everybody just thinks inflation. Well, there's all different ways you can get sustained rise in general level prices. And there's not a good understanding of that. And then in light of these different diseases, different types of inflation, there's probably different policies that can address the situation. So we don't take a very sophisticated approach to the problem.
Interesting. Okay, guys, time for mean tweets, and whoever's pushing buttons backstage. Okay, so we have Betard Freedom at 13 Cardes on May 24th. Steve, you've done this before. Do you read that bottom part or do I read that?
You read it out.
Oh, okay. Steve, the self promo intro thing tells me to not take your ideas seriously. FYI. Self
I saw
promo.
that
Are you
one
self
myself.
promo?
Yeah, I know. Actually, that's been done by the marketing firm, and I've got this love-hate relationship with the people doing the marketing for me because there's no way I get. Now, that was about a 12.5-minute video. They're doing a bloody good job, I've got to say, putting the whole thing together. They're trying to market my online courses, which I give on Wednesdays and Thursdays through the thing stevekeenfree.com. I'm a bit peeved by some of the way they market, but I'm sorry, this is a capitalist economy. You're criticizing me for doing capitalist things and advertising. Well, that's cute. Uh,
Okay.
so I basically ignored that tweet.
Yeah. Samuel at
That
come on, do I have to,
actually,
at
I can prove that's
Jizzlips.
not true because I find it. Steve Keen is great for insomnia. I wish it were true. If I could talk and make myself fall asleep, I have much better sleep. So
Okay. L Cost Care at L Cost Care. This is fact. Steve is a pasty white as they come because he's scared of the sun.
one of my sisters got the tanning genes in our family. The rest of us are white as ghosts, and I spent an enormous amount of time in the Australian sun. And the first time I ever did that with non-Anglo friends, I had two Sri Lankan friends when I was at in high school, at beginning of high school, and they turned a more gorgeous shade of brown over one day at a place called Carrs Park in the south of Sydney. And I spent 3 days in a vinegar bath with extremely severe sunburn. So yes, I'm afraid of the sun.
Guilty as charged. Okay, that's fun. Haven't done that
Turning into a
before,
lobster.
but
Ghost says turn into a lobster. Dead right. And the thing is, I felt worse than a lobster. Don't know whether it tasted like one, but I certainly felt worse than one.
Mike's done. He's had enough. He's just completely had it. He's just left. He said, "I'm done." Oh no!
No, I was looking at my bookshelf.
Steve, those were really mean tweets. Oh, I don't think that's fair.
That's nothing on what I get on a weekly basis, and they're actually pretty polite, pretty tame. That trio. So I'm actually. I thought you might put one of the George Selgin ones up, but let's do those mean tweets when George is. Actually, tell you what. Let's arrange some of George's tweets about my reply to his paper and put them up during our conversation, which what in 2 weeks' time. That should be fun.
Yeah, watch that. It was fun.
The pasty white one was good.
The pasty white one, yeah. Guilty, right? So, Mr.
I can't beat that one. I'm stuck. I definitely am an old white male, which is the sort of person you shouldn't listen to.
Yeah.
Oh, Steve, that's not.
I want to go back to Mike's comment about modeling the various different proposals, I guess, right? And what I like about that suggestion is there is a way to do that in such a way where that stays apolitical. I mean, you got a conservative proposal, you've got a liberal proposal. Properly modeling that, I think, would be very interesting as a matter of on-demand, like modeling the system to actually show and educate people what the implications of those policies actually are on an ongoing basis, right? I think that would be a great project to task your graduate class with.
Yeah, so I think it would be great as well. The issue would be getting a scoring metric that everybody agreed to, because you usually don't have a situation where you offer a policy change and the red curve, which is bad, is going up, and now the red curve, which is bad, is going down. Voila, we solved something. Usually you have trade-offs, right? You have a multi-attribute utility function, scoring, whatever you want to say. Think about, what makes a good city? Well, I want good schools, open space, low crime, no potholes, and what have you. And if you get more of one, you need more police officers, you get less crayons for the kids in the school. So there's a trade-off. Well, so on net then, when you go with design A, design B, or design C, here are the implications, but then it's like, do we all agree on how we're going to score or evaluate each of the proposed, system redesigns, if you will? But yes, in principle, it seems to me that's the way to go, because a lot of times you'll hear people offering solutions. How do you fix the U.S. healthcare system? And there's a whole bunch of different Medicare for all, and then market-based solutions and what have you, but nobody ever models them and directly compares the implications.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And what do you think if you were going to look at that? Are there any differences between the way Mike is describing that? And I'm thinking he's thinking more of a North American, U.S.-centric economy. What are your thoughts from a UK standpoint, and then also from maybe the Africans? How do you see what Mike has said as translating into some of these into those economies on the other side of the ocean there?
Well, I think there is a lot of debate around models and around the system and what the system should be like. But on the whole, there's not enough of that sort of debate. I think sadly, because we don't, for example, discuss the way the system impacts on ordinary people sufficiently, what we've had is we've developed this incredibly unequal and unfair and unjust global financial system where the 1% are doing very, very well and the 99% are struggling. And we have nothing to say to that except, we could have a technical fix here and there. And the result is that the right have moved into this vacuum and said, we know the answer to that. We know the answer. So the answer to that is, let's give you our model. Our model is, let's put up a wall between you and Mexico, right? Let's put up tariffs against the Chinese. They think of all of these reactionary policies. And the public say, oh, God, somebody is trying to protect me from this financial system. Thank God for that. I'm going to vote for Trump. I'm going to vote for, in Europe, Europe is going to move to the far right. So the far right has got answers, and it doesn't sit in ivory towers thinking up those answers. It's out there explaining to the public the way in which to deal with the imbalances in the system, the way in which to deal with the 1%. Says John Trump, says Trump as a member of that 1%. This is the way to deal with it. Hammer immigrants, put up walls, and give tax breaks to the rich. And the public are falling for that because this is a model that has been explained to them, and that what is explained to them is that it's going to protect them from the instability of the current international financial system. And the left is silent. The left is saying, oh, well, it's terribly, it's all this technocratic and it's accounting and God knows what they're saying. There is no voice for an alternative system. There's virtually, and I'm generalizing here, of course, immensely, but there's no debate and agreement around an alternative system to the one that we have at the moment. So I'm waffling there a little bit, Dan, but I just feel, that if we look at what the right is thinking and how the right is thinking about modeling the economy and how popular that is with the people get it. The people understand. People understand if you control immigration, that might protect my job. They're falling for all of these policies. And what have we got to say? We're in our ivory towers, I'm afraid.
I do think that one issue with developing economies is that Western economists tend to think, well, this particular thing worked for us, we'll just plop it into another nation. Again, they don't get out from behind their desks and find out what's going on. So you find out with monetary policies in a lot of African nations, for example, they have microfinancing suzus that handle much of the, if you will, banking. And so to plop down a central bank interest rate policy from the US in that economy is silly, because a lot of what happens banking wise happens in this informal village level SUSU structure, right? And economists don't know that because they never find out what happens by getting out from behind their desk and finding out, and wherever they're going to start intervening, how does the system work now?
Yeah, very good. Steve, what are your thoughts?
My mouse. Hang on, there we go. Pardon me. Sorry, I'm being unmuted by the host. Thank you. I think the large there's a beginning of a development of the left putting forward, or the progressive movements putting forward an alternative, and that is talking about industrial policy, which is now turning up. And Mariana Mazzucato has made a lot of noise on that front, as has Isabella Weber. And you're getting two people saying we have to have an industrial policy about how we rebuild what have been deconstructed economies over the last 50 years. Because if you take a look at what's happened to so-called advanced economies in the last 50 years, particularly England, but also America and Australia, the Anglo-Saxon countries that swallowed neoliberalism, they've deindustrialized. They've lost the capacity to build industrial might, in the same sense that China has accumulated that power. And you've had far more focusing upon the growth of the financial sector and services, and that's actually ended up causing what Yanis Varoufakis described as techno-feudalism. You've got the financial sector dominates the industrial. So we need to go back to the stage where the industrial dominates the financial. Now, on that front, I will throw one criticism of MMT in here, and that's the whole exports are a cost, imports are a benefit line, which I just take as a straight line. It's not derived from the accounting logic at all, but that really underplays the importance of manufacturing and production. And fundamentally says if you produce stuff, you're being a bit of a fool. Why? If you can buy goods with money, and you money in one direction, goods in the other, you come out ahead. I think that's a trader's perspective, and it's wrong about countries which, if you want to develop and build into extra capacity for people over time, then you have to have a manufacturing sector. You have to have industrial policy. So we need to marry MMT's correct wisdom about government money creation with the approach of what's called the circuit school, which is what I come from, which is the role of private money creation and the whole banking sector, and combine that with a knowledge of how goods and services are produced, and start cultivating the rebuilding of the manufacturing capability that's been lost in the West over the last 50 years. And forget it, Michael. Yes, I know there's real cost and real benefit stuff. I think it's a wank. Okay, there's been much better logic than that MMT could do to simply say exports are a cost, imports are a benefit, real cost, real benefit. You're getting caught up on opportunity cost. You want to annoy me, start talking opportunity cost, which is very much a neoclassical concept. I'm happy to hammer anybody who tries to use that as a basis for talking about how our economy should develop over time. So there is just a weakness. I think it's, if MMT correctly thought about the production side of the economy as well as the monetary side, we'd have a much better version of MMT.
Can I ask a question of both Steve and Anne? I guess maybe Anne is our guest, so we'll ask her first. But Steve as well is, what are your thoughts on speculation as that does real harm to the financial system, whether it's in housing or financial assets or currency pairs and what have you, and policy suggestions like a Tobin tax or something like that to damp down speculation?
Well, I mean, I think it's incredibly important, and I'm busy. Part of my book that I hope to publish next year is about the fact that this easy money, this deregulated credit that's issued, in huge, vast quantities, means that out there in the stratosphere, the financial stratosphere, there's something like $213 trillion of financial assets. The real GDP, the real economy, the real global economy generates only $100 trillion of income a year, GDP. So there's this huge amount of money that has nowhere to go, essentially. It's made up of privatized pension funds. It's made up of, these asset management funds scooping up the world's savings and then not knowing what to do with it. And there's London property. You could put it into London property, but there's a finite amount of London or Australian or American property too. And so it goes into speculation, and the main speculative activity is in the commodity markets, the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, the London Metals Exchange, the New York CME Mercantile Exchange. So grain is speculated on in Chicago, oil is speculated on in New York, copper is speculated on here in London, right? And so this wall of money is aimed at these finite resources, copper, grain, or oil, and inflating their prices. And so for me, speculation has played an enormous part in the current inflation, cost of living crisis. And nobody talks about it. The Bank of England, the governor of the Bank of England says we've got inflation because wages are too high. Nothing could be more ridiculous. Wages have improved since the pandemic here in the UK, but on the whole, they're still below what they were before 2008. So, that the governor of the Bank of England should blame workers for what's happening in Chicago or New York, in London, is just terribly unfair. But the real problem is this easy money, this unregulated credit, which is like, it's like the sorcerer's apprentice. They've turned on a tap and created all of this credit, this easy money, deregulated pensions. There is that, and that speculative activity, that desperate search for safe collateral, that desperate search for assets into which one can hope to generate, because if you're sitting on cash, as Steve said a minute ago, is not interest bearing. So it's of no use to you. You need to put it somewhere where it'll earn interest. And whether that's in the price of the oil going up or whatever, really it doesn't matter as long as you can earn some form of rent from it. So that's a really big problem. And it's a problem we don't understand, Mike. So we think, President Putin fixes the price of oil by managing, as Steve has said, this thing of supply and demand. By reducing supply, he pushes up the price of oil. So he fixes it. And that's not true. Putin has no power over the price of oil. The Chicago Mercantile Exchange has power over the price of oil. The Saudis have no power over the price. Dear old Tesla has power to fix the price of Teslas. But the Saudis don't have the price to fix the price of a commodity oil, which is fixed by speculators largely. There is a supply and demand issue, of course, but largely by speculation in global commodity markets. And we ignore those markets. We ignore that wall of money, and we focus on what's here happening at domestic level, wages or whatever. And that, for me, is the problem. That's what I'm writing about at the moment.
A real macro approach. Well, Anne, you did such a good job. How's your voice? Like, is it starting to get a little sore? Do you think you can?
It is. I need my afternoon cup of tea, I'm afraid. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna ask you if you can do the top chatters list, and then we'll give you a break. Can you run through these with us?
Oh
together?
My God! I've never done this before. I have to read these names, do I?
Yes. Yep.
Oh my God. Tamal Surdesh, Tony Wilson, Direk Jaya, Economics in One Lesson, Gavin Van, Larry Summers, oh my God, TR, D. Bruce, Douglas Dowell, Langdell, Ghost on Half Shell, Tom Roberts, Political Economy 101, Bob Lior, Harvey Kay, Chris Focus in Excel, Tom Kopp, oh, I like that, Joe Polito, Graham Boyd, Danny, Blue Bay, Matt 3431433, Torrential Rage, Danger Zone, Jesus, Michael D'Souza Cruz, Chase B. Anderson, Philippe Burns, Django Geek, Mano Harron, Josh Buckham, Petrified Produce, Ronald Vermvolt, Bob Dones, or Dones, Andrew Sullivan, Snert Rich, Doc Tuxon, Shot, Thomas Darlington, Owen Wall, Cacao Bob, Rick O'Brien, Michael Newman, J.D. Rybel, Malchieri.
You did it. She's so lovely in how she's doing that, right? Yes. Yeah. I like the surprise
that I had to do that.
I like this.
It always sounds better with a British accent.
Yeah, yeah, and the one with Jesus or Jesus sounded a little bit surprised, right? Like Jesus. that was cute. Mike, what are your thoughts?
On
what?
On what? Thoughts on what?
Well,
reading the list.
We should. Well, you know what? Actually, I think we should bring it back to modern monetary theory. Where do you think we're at? Have we offered a real good criticism? Are we acknowledging Anne's critique? You know, what are your thoughts at this point in the show? Because we've got a half an hour left, and I'd like to assume somebody just came into the show, and they want an update. Where are we at? So
I would say I wholeheartedly agree that speculation needs to be examined, and it's really isn't very much. But yet, going back to tulip bulbs and South Sea Island shares, it is a problem. You have the forces of supply and demand, right, which are negative feedback loops, thermostats trying to stabilize systems, and speculation is a positive feedback process that destabilizes systems. And generally speaking, unstable systems are not good. So, how do you reduce the incentives to speculate? Well, Jim Tobin had, his Tobin tax idea. I haven't really heard a lot of other suggestions. And so, having that be a research area and thinking about where speculation really causes harm, and how to, if not eliminate it, dampen it, I think is a super important topic area. So yeah, kudos to Anne for beginning to do a deep dive on that.
Steve, what do you think about the stratification of like income disparity and wealth disparity? Is there a natural argument for this kind of a stratification, for a hierarchy?
No, there is a natural argument, and that is that virtually any system that involves interaction between different entities leads to a power law distribution of the size of those entities. So even if you had a totally random process of interaction, you get a power law distribution out of the wealth. What we've had is actually far beyond a power law. But with the power law, by the way, the small number of people get the largest amount, a large number of people get the smallest amount. And if you do a plot of the log of the number of the people versus the log of the income, you get a straight line coming out of that. That's called a power law. And natural phenomena abound in that. So earthquakes, because one earthquake, one movement of one tectonic plate or one fault line causes movement in another one, and there's a cascade effect. You get a power distribution. Very small number of extremely powerful earthquakes, large number of extremely weak earthquakes, and basically a straight line plot between the Richter scale on one side and the number of earthquakes of that scale, the logarithm of them on the vertical. So it's a natural phenomenon to have inequality. I think what's happened in capitalism, particularly under the neoliberal period, is a dramatic amplification of that inequality. So the extent to which the wealthy have been able to evade paying tax, this comes back to Lan's point about how do you enforce tax, evade paying tax, put their money off in offshore havens like the Cayman Islands and Ireland and so on, and therefore pay far less tax. The money that's being created by the government is being taken out of circulation, out of the pockets of the poor and the middle class. And that's a large part which has fueled the rise of Donald Trump and even Thatcher conservatives, because when taxation is visible and unavoidable for the working class and the middle class, it's invisible and quite avoidable for the wealthy. And so out of that, you've got a huge increase in inequality, and then all the increase in the monetary system we've had, where you've been driving up the value of assets. That again is hypercharged wealth inequality. So it's an incredibly unfair and ineffective system. And we can see it breaking down, if not economically, it's breaking down politically. We're going to see this with a bit of fun, I hope, Anne, in the forthcoming UK election, because the party which has been most responsible for that increase in inequality in the UK in the last 15 years is going to have a very unequal distribution of the seats in Parliament next time round. We've only got to wait, 6 weeks, haven't we, to actually see it happen?
Should all be over.
Yeah.
But and they're going to be, I mean, it's really awful. We know that the Prime Minister's taken the day off today from the election campaign, which is astounding. On day 3 of the election campaign, the Prime Minister disappears. And the rumor is that he's going to resign, and that the Tory party may not have a leader to run this campaign. But of course, he might just be thinking.
That is quite a possibility, because, I mean, people who haven't seen it, you should go on YouTube and look for the election announced by Rishi Sunak, because there he is standing outside of number 10 in the rain without an umbrella, water pouring on him.
Yeah.
It's a strange expression for that. You're being pissed on, mate. And I saw some explanation. I think it was Robert Peston, who's one of the fairly prominent commentators in the UK, said that he thought he's a very, apparently, we don't know Sunak, but apparently he's quite an impetuous and he goes off the handle very easily, apparently. And he said he made it decided he was about to get shafted by the, whatever they call the 1923 committee, I think it is, and of the backbenchers. They may have been asking for him. Yet another resignation of a prime minister before an election was becoming likely. He may simply just straight out, bugger you lot, I'm going to call a fucking election, goes out in the rain and announces it and walks back inside. He's taking day 3 off of the... Yeah, day 3. He probably is going to resign.
Well, it's, I mean, it's extraordinary. So it's complete implosion of this political party, which has had 14 years of government and which has been a party of deregulation and financialization. He's a very wealthy man, married to a woman whose father is a global member of a billionaire, basically. And they have messed up majorly. And at last, the public is getting a chance to say so. We've been denied that for some time now. But it's going to be devastating. It's going to happen quite quickly relative to American elections, I have to say.
The last time I saw an election like this was the actually Australian election when the Labor Party lost out to John Howard, which is a great pity. But what the expression they used by the papers was that the electorate was waiting for the party with the baseball bat. I think the British party is waiting for the Tories with a cricket bat, and it's going to be wielded quite brutally on what is it? Is the 6th of July, or what is the actual date?
The 4th of July. The 4th of July.
Good, yeah.
4th of July. Even better, the 4th of July. England politics is going to go up in flames on the 4th of July. Mike, America finally wins the War of Independence.
I was going to say, that's a special day. So I think one of the things that Anne has pointed out resonates very much with me. I think she's spot on, and it's the issue of power. Right, because if you're a traditionally trained economist, you think about, well, you vote with your dollars, you vote with your feet. So power can be undermined, competition undermines market power and all that stuff. But in the real world, that's not true. You have economic power, you have political power. They're often and probably usually intertwined. In terms of economic power, I think more has been done to try and think about how to disaggregate it, right? Everything from antitrust laws to worker-owned firms and unions and profit sharing and stuff like that. And that's not always implemented, but at least some thought has been given to how do you dissipate economic power. Political power, different story, right? The U.S. presumably 250 years ago came up with a system of checks and balances in an effort to, stop at least the central government from being giant and powerful after, speaking of the 4th of July, after the Revolutionary War, the former colonies of England, who were going to become states, the last thing they wanted to do was create a powerful central government with a military. They just got rid of one. So they created a system of checks and balances to try and, keep government at the state level or even the local level, but certainly not the central central government level. And of course, today, the founding fathers in the United States are probably spinning in their graves when they see what's happened. So how you handle political power, the accumulation of political power, and then when people get it, they wield it in their own interests. I don't care what they say. I don't know how you fix that. We're going back to the history of humankind. Human beings like power, and they wield it in their own interests when they get it.
So this is where I think Roosevelt comes into this picture, really. And this comes back to my book, The Case for the Green New Deal. And I think it's still relevant, even though the Green New Deal seems to have disappeared of the agenda. But Roosevelt was very clear that the very first task he had was to curtail the political power of Wall Street. On the night of his inauguration, he announced that he was going to close down the system of the gold standard. And that would mean that he'd have to demand from the banks that they hand over the gold that they had, and that power to determine the exchange rate, to determine effectively the interest rate, to determine the flow of capital across borders, those huge powers that Wall Street enjoyed were going to be stripped of Wall Street. And his staff said to him, you can't do that tomorrow because tomorrow's Sunday. It's a holy day. You've got to wait till Monday. So he waits till Monday and he closes the banks. And the story is that he closed the banks in order to fix the banks. But no, he didn't. He closed the banks in order to get his hands on their gold and to take that power away from it. And for reasons that have to do with the state of the economy in those at that time, Wall Street went along with this for some reason. And so, but he then develops Wall Street as an enemy. And he makes that wonderful speech in, I can't remember which year it is, it's at 37, in which he says, I love their hatred. They hate me and I love their hatred of me. So for me, the Green New Deal was about the first thing we have to do is to curtail the power of Wall Street. And Wall Street's power extends far beyond the United States. It affects me in my daily life when Wall Street firms come here and take over the surgery, my local general GP surgery. So, curtailing Wall Street's power is the number, and nobody talks about that. It's not an issue. Roosevelt was clear in his inaugural speech. He made it very clear this is what he was going to do. And he did it. And he used his political power to do that. And he was the most popular president ever, et cetera, et cetera. And then once he'd managed Wall Street, he could then tackle the environmental crisis that the United States faced, which was the drought, which was, the Dust Bowl. And so then he began to invest in that. He invested in other aspects of the economy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So nothing could be done until that power had been curtailed. And he understood that and did it. And that took courage. But he also had the base for it, really. And he had the advice of, I may say so, John Maynard Keynes. So I think that's really what we have to talk about, because it's not just any old thing out there. There is institutional power in Wall Street, and it's captured so much of the state. It's captured the central bank. The Federal Reserve exists to defend Wall Street. The Bank of England exists to protect the interests of the City of London and the global financial markets, not to protect the people of Britain. And instinctively, the Trumpians know that. Instinctively, the supporters of the far right know that the 1%, that the powerful elites, the financial elites, have got that sort of power and that sort of control, and that's what gets challenged by the right. So I'm ranting and raving again.
No, I want to know what you.
We can't do anything we want to do until we do something about the ability of Wall Street just to create endless quantities of credit, and to operate a shadow banking system, and to, flood the world with money, which has nowhere sensible to go.
Yeah, and how do you view? And can you say a few words on the Occupy movement? In terms of its success, how it aligns with with your vision? Can you talk a little bit about the
Yeah, I mean,
Occupy movement?
I was incredibly, well, first of all, it was founded by my dear friend and Steve's dear friend, David Graeber. And I was thrilled that they took on what I thought was Joseph Stiglitz' framing of the 1% versus the 90%. And I was even more thrilled when they chose to camp outside Wall Street. The failure, I think, was to refuse to understand the power of the state and of how to use the power of the state to challenge Wall Street. It wasn't sufficient just to have a camp and just to occupy that piece of land. There was another, and David, whom I love dearly, was not in favor of the state and didn't want to use the state, or to didn't want to take it that step further, it seemed to me. And I think we have to do that. We have to understand that we have to take the power that Wall Street has taken onto itself for the majority, for the 99%. And until we start thinking in those terms and of how to do it, our protests will not go anywhere. And Occupy, sadly, didn't go very far. Neither here.
And do you think an individual president or a prime minister can do anything about the shadow banking system? I mean, FDR, you showed as a case study of how it could be done, but that was in the 1930s. We're approaching 100 years ago. I'm not entirely sure today. They would call it the deep state here in the U.S. that the president can say whatever, and these people do whatever they want anyway. So I hate to be pessimistic sounding, but I don't know. What do you think?
No, I'm pessimistic with you because, Wall Street has bought the US Congress. And, and here, our opposition party here is the Labour Party, but the Labour Party is completely in the pocket of, and it's very open about that, of the City of London. The last thing it wants to do is to rattle the cage of the City of London. And so there's a lack of courage and spine, if you like. And that's because of the enormous power that the financial system operates. And the lack of courage and the lack of intellectual integrity. But that in turn is a result of the movement, the grassroots movement, if you like, not growing the kind of leaders that we need that would have courage, really.
You almost have to have a world financial crisis, sort of like with long-term capital management or one of these things where you got them cornered, and then you say, if you don't want to go down in flames, we're going to reorganize things.
Mike, that's my grievance against the left. In 2007, Wall Street was on its knees. The City of London had collapsed, right? And I remember the moment so well between 2007 and 2008 when you could tell the bankers believed they were going to jail, right? And they had this moment of nervousness. And they felt that they deserved to go to jail. They had messed up major. And what happened was, here in Britain, Gordon Brown said, please, would you come into the Treasury and advise us on how to fix the system? And the same thing happened in the United States. And to their astonishment, they were pulled in to fix the system. I mean, actually, there was a bit more of a fight on the Hill against that than there was here. The $700 million that they asked for overnight, that sort of thing. You could see there was resistance coming from Congress, but Congress capitulated, really. But the point is this, that since 2007-9, the banks, which before the crisis were likely to go bust, were going to be bankrupted. Some absolutely were. Post 2007, no bank is too small, too big to fail, right? No bank will fail. No big banker will go to jail. They can't believe their luck, because what happened through the crisis is that the state came, rescued them, and made sure that, and the system consolidated itself. And they made sure that actually now these banks could never fail because, they're backed by, there's a Soviet-style banking system. It's backed by the Federal Reserve, for God's sake. And why? Because the left stood there in the middle of the financial crisis and said, we didn't know this could happen, right? A bit like Greenspan. Greenspan didn't know this could happen, nor could those on the progressive end of the... And so we had no plan B. We had no way
we
of...
had a plan. We had a plan B for people like you and myself, Amber. We didn't get listened to.
We
And
didn't get me and Steve didn't get listened to. We were laughed at.
There's a few others. I mean, we've got to admit, you've got to give Robert
Sure.
Schiller his view. He's somebody who actually came out and warned about it. Muriel Rubini and so on. So there were contrary voices saying we have to do something and we have to reduce the power of the banks. That's when I put forward my debt jubilee idea. All these things to reduce the power of the financial sector. And we didn't get a look in. Instead, they got bloody, Larry Summers. G'day, Larry. And who's the other jerk who I've forgotten his name. I actually met him, who became Treasury Secretary. Paul Paulson is one, but
Hank Paulson.
Sorry?
Robert
Hank
Paulson.
Paulson's one, but there's another guy.
Yeah.
There's another guy. I've forgotten his name right now, but they got the idea of Obama, and what did they tell him? But to do the money multiplier.
Yeah.
You see the speech that Obama gave, and I remember it vividly because I've read it so many times. In 2000, Geithner, thank you, Timothy Geithner.
Yeah.
And the speech he gave us said a lot of Americans say they wonder why they're giving money to the banks rather than to the households. Where's our bailout? They asked. Classic Obama speak. He said the truth is that an extra dollar of money in banks can result in $8 or $10 more of loans to the private sector, a multiplier effect which will lead to a faster rate of economic growth. Now, of course, it's completely failed. It was the slowest recovery in the history of American recessions, right back from literally they began recording them back in the early 1800s. The banks can't lend out reserves. And this is all the reason, again, why I'm overall a fan of MMT, because they're saying, let's get some realism in here. Banks can't lend reserves. It's simply impossible for them to do that unless the monetary system is entirely in cash, which it is not. So there's the neoclassical myths dominated the so-called recovery from the financial crisis. And I want to bring a bit back to the Great Depression. The big difference, the reason why Rockefeller, Roosevelt could do so much was that the unemployment rate, as recorded in America in October 1929, was about 5,000 people, and it totaled 0%. To the rounding error, 0.0. Less than 0.05%. So the recorded unemployment rate by the NBER in October 1929 was 0. 3 years later, it was 25%. You also, of course, this is before we had Glass-Steagall. So a large part of the reason for the severe crash was banks had shares. And when the stock market collapsed 10% in one day, the asset banking of the banks also collapsed that much. And one other thing most people aren't aware of, I've read this because I've been putting my most recent books together. I found data on margin loans. Now, margin loans at the moment are about 2 or 3% of GDP, which is high on historical standards. But from 1921, they began at about 1% of GDP. And by 1929, they were 9% of GDP. And also margin loans, you could take out, the margin loans were 10% down, 90% provided by the broker. So with $100,000, you could buy $1 million worth of shares, and therefore a 10% fall in shares would wipe out your equity, and margin calls came in. On 10% of GDP, that meant an enormous collapse in the creditworthiness of the non-banking public. And then because the banks all had shares, they collapsed. The banking sector destroyed itself. And at that time, the government was quite small. The government was about 5% of GDP, total government spending. So the extent to which the government was an automatic stabilizer in the opposite direction was trivial back at the Great Depression. It's 6 times larger now. So this means we've got an auto-correcting mechanism that lets the banking sector get away with bad behavior.
Yeah.
Wow. Interesting. He caught me off guard because I was processing everything that you're saying, and there's lots of stuff in there. And you're nodding and agreeing a lot because you had a very similar proposal put forth after that crash. And would you summarize what Steve said as correct? And do you have anything to color or add to that?
No, Steve's absolutely right. Steve and I agree on so much, actually, and Steve's brilliant. I'm a fan. And but he's right. He's right about that. And he was right before. I mean, I fell in love with Steve before the crisis, because he had those wonderful debt numbers, and he was way out there in far outback Australia, and he was publishing these. It was such a breath of fresh air, really. Yeah. So no, we agree on all that. We don't agree on everything around MMT, but we agree on that.
You guys, have you guys?
Let's get a personal anecdote here, because the first time I met Anne, we were corresponding, I think, before we came out to Australia. But you gave a talk in the Amalgamated Metal Workers Union building, which was just around the corner from where I live, as I happen. I used to actually work with the metal workers at one point, not fully employed by them, but working with their research officer. So we actually met inside there. And you said you're a bit scared about meeting me first time round. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I was. I was in awe of you, Steve. I still am. Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know. That's where I was actually going to go. I was going to say, like, you guys have met on multiple occasions, I suppose.
Yeah.
And
well, I think the first time when was that, Anne? 2006, or when would it have been?
Don't.
Sorry. Okay, I know. Yeah.
So long ago, 17.
Grey hair.
I can't believe it was 17, 18 years ago. Yeah.
It's terrifying, but true. Yeah, that long ago.
And
there's
so
only a handful.
knows...
There's still a handful, just like yourself, me, Michael Hudson, Dirk Bessemer was a later he did a great job of pulling us all together. But there's still quite a minority of people, even in progressive economic circles, who work on credit.
Yeah.
And
no.
the MMT's put in great stuff.
He has money into the foreground, really, and I really do salute that and admire that. And I'm also quite relieved by it, because I just, but Keynes was that's what Keynes argued. Keynes's general theory of employment, interest, and money. He had no interest in fiscal policy, effectively. He thought you had to apply fiscal policy in a crisis, but for God's sake, don't get yourself into that mess. Fix monetary policy. His line was, if you fix the monetary system, you won't need to, have to resort to fiscal policy. The thing will move along steadily on its own. And so to see monetary policy buried, and actually macroeconomics buried by the economics profession, is just awful. And so MMT at least have done that. They've brought it back up front. But I'm just arguing that we should get the thing right in order to, and the more right we get it, the less vulnerable we are to attack from the right, the far right, the reactionaries, the orthodoxies. And the more we get it actually perfect, the more powerful it will be, because it will resonate with the public.
Yeah.
Is that the conservatives don't want to know this material. They don't want to, like, I've just, having recently decided to debate with a neoclassical about money creation, and seeing the piss weak reply that he made to my paper, I realized they don't want to listen to us, Anne. They don't read what you and I write. What they do instead, they skim what you and I write, looking for something to disagree with. And because they come from a different paradigm, they can easily find that. Then they shut down, they walk away, they think they've won the debate. So I see the incredible.
We live in a different world now, Steve. Back even 17 years ago, it was harder to communicate with a bigger audience. But look at you now, for God's sake. You've got this channel, and so we have more opportunities of talking to people. And I think there's much greater awareness than there was pre-2007.
There is awareness, but it hasn't gone far enough. And look, I've got 2,000 viewers right now for this show, which is great. I've got 100,000 people who follow me on Twitter, great. But the number of, if you look at if I put a cat video out, I might get 5 million views. We're hitting this triviality side of humanity as well. So even though we're communicating, we're still talking inside a very small group of people. And the majority continue believing the shit they got taught in university and newspapers about the government spending meaning borrowing from the public, and banks being better than the private, et cetera, et cetera. And you simply can't fight when they don't listen.
And that brings me back to what Mike said, which is that we will learn, but we will learn the hard way. We will learn through catastrophe, through an implosion, and through what we have now, you know. And this brings me back to Karl Polanyi, who argued that it was precisely the deregulated laissez-faire system of the 1920s and 30s which led to the rise of fascism, which led to a catastrophic world war. And we learned from that and got Bretton Woods. You know, if this is how humanity and society learns, God help us, really. And I share Mike's pessimism, because looking out the window, I see only reaction and conservatism and the right and the rise of the far right. In India, you know, you have Modi, his nationalism, his racism. You have Netanyahu. In Israel, you have Putin. In Russia, you know, you have Mr. What's he called in Argentina? Mr. Milei. Is it Milei? You know, we see the rise of these authoritarians, and in exactly the same way that happened in the 1930s. And we will learn from that, but it will have done an enormous amount of damage before that learning takes place.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a question for you, Anne.
Yeah.
I'd like to kind of wrap up the show with 5 minutes left, and I'd like to get your perspective on the climate reality.
Yeah.
I mean, we've had a long. I usually like to do that much earlier, but basically, we've had a really engaging conversation around modern monetary theory, the nuances of that, which are really predicated on economies, GDPs, growth-centric models, and bringing this back to the confidence of a normatively constructed system of money and trust, and yet there's this instability that we're standing on, and a trajectory of collapse thundering towards us in a reality that I just how do you find solid ground in a world where we're trying to make policies and we're trying to instill confidence based off of a collapsing economic model that's predicated on growth?
Yeah. No, absolutely. You know, part of my thing about the monetary system is that we have to find a way to do what we have to do to save human civilization from collapse, essentially. I'm a member of the Scottish Government's Just Transition Commission. And last week, we were up in Shetland. And Shetland has...
Oh, that's weird.
Way up north. My God, it's cold and windy. And they're building an enormous wind farm on Shetland. They have offshore wind, they have tidal energy, and they have oil and gas in Shetland. Now, back in 1973-74, the oil companies discovered oil off the island of Shetland, and they came to the local town council, the authority, and said, well, we want to dig oil here. We want to extract oil. And the islanders said, no, we don't want you. Go away. We don't want any oil here. Thank you very much. Go and find oil elsewhere. And they said, no, we must. And they put pressure on and so on. And eventually the council said, okay, you can invest and you can begin to extract oil, but here are the terms and conditions. And one of the terms and conditions is that we will have a share of your takings from that oil. Today, that little local authority in a town called Lerwick in Shetland, tiny place, has got £400 million in a charitable account, which is taken off the oil companies, right? And that was because they legislated to give power to the citizens over this new form of asset extraction, which was going to do so much harm to the environment in and around Shetland. today they're putting up wind farms and there's no such control. Wind farms are being financed by global financial institutions. They're just sweeping across the whole land. There's massive infrastructure that goes with wind farms. And that's, destabilizing the island. Plus, the offshore wind farms are destabilizing the marine sector in that part of the world. Fishing is a big, big deal for the Shetlanders. They export enormous quantities of fish. And it just rolls on. Now, the fishermen are going to have to be compensated. The people, the restoration of peat is going to be absolutely essential, because peat is both is responsible for carbon emissions, but if it's restored to health, it soaks up. It's a carbon capture system, right? But all of that takes money, and there is no money to do that. But of course, we know there is money. We know that there are ways in which we could use the monetary system to make all of that happen. And yet we've got our hands tied behind our backs, and we're told by the City of London there just isn't enough money. But if you want some money, we've got some money for you, and this is the rate of interest on that money. And can I just say that I don't think MMT pays enough attention to the rate of interest and to a theory of the rate of interest. And it's massively extractive. It's massively exploitative, right? And so the poor people of Shetland have been abandoned. And of course, it's an island. They are far more vulnerable to massive. The reason we have wind farms there is because they have constant wind. They're going to be so destabilized by the climate. It's extraordinary. And we're going to say, sorry, there's nothing we can do because there is no money. So for me, there is this very powerful connection between the way in which we construct our monetary system and use it. And we know we can do it because it is a human and social construct. To use it for good purposes, and we're refusing to do that. We're rather, as you say, watch the oncoming collapse in a hypnotic way and just wait to lie down and die, essentially. And on that cheerful note, I shall stop.
Thank you, Anne. Thanks for joining us. And everybody, that's another episode of Steve and Friends. Thank you for joining us. See you next week.
Thank you.